Hello and welcome to Romance Studies 202, Modernism to the Present. And today I'm delighted to be in conversation to have with me Claudia Dellacasa, Professor Claudia Dellacasa, who is a lecturer at the School of Modern Languages and Culture in the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and the author of, amongst other things, the book Italo Calvino and Japan, A Journey Through the Shallow Depths of Signs, a fantastic title. We're here to talk about this book by Italo Calvino, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. You've got it presumably in the Italian there. I've got the translation. And thank you so much for your time and for being willing to talk about this fascinating book. How would you suggest approaching it?
This is probably the hardest question that we can begin with, because this is metafictional book, or hyper metafictional book, if you want. So we as readers are included in the book. And the first time I read it, going from cover to cover, and probably I didn't necessarily enjoy it as much because I shared some of the impatience and frustration that the reader, the protagonist of this book, goes through. I was rereading it before this conversation, and I just decided to read the frame. And interestingly enough, I find that only by focusing on the frame, the book works much better as a novel per se, because you follow like one main plot story, although the plot itself kind of ramifies and it's quite tentacular as it progresses. But then, of course, a reader who has never approached this book has to go through the frustration. So has to go through a frame that starts by including the reader, as I said, and then it stops, and then it includes the beginning of one novel, and then the novel immediately stops and the frame starts again. So you go back to the reader and you encounter him as he's completely puzzled as to why the book has stopped. So you follow him as he goes back to the bookshop and brings the book back to the bookseller and says, there's something wrong here. And then he's given another copy, so he starts reading another copy. So probably the first time reading this book, we have to accompany the reader, the protagonist, through this quest. So we have to follow Calvino in this challenge that he poses to us. And then maybe at different points in our life as readers, maybe we can go back to it and focus on maybe one chapter or the frame, as I did. And every chapter has a sort of different style, a different vibe, if you want. So there is almost like a Russian novel, there is a Borgesian fable, there is a Japanese chapter. So everyone has something to enjoy in this book.
And then, well, if we stick with the frame for a little bit, yes, of course, the
Yeah.
book addresses you as you, or us,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
readers, as us. Of course, as it goes along, the the imagined reader becomes more and more specific, and perhaps it becomes more difficult to feel included. And so we get a
Mm,
proliferation of other kinds of readers as well. We get the
yes.
reader, and then the other reader, and then Ludmilla, and then the other reader's sister, Lotaria, and so on. And we get a whole different set of models, perhaps, of how to read. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about what this book says about different approaches to reading any book, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. Like, it's hard to know who Calvino would have identified with, but it's clearly it's clear from this book that he was aware as he was writing this book, and maybe as he was writing many of his other best-selling books, that that there is such a wide spectrum of possible readers. So there is even the non-reader, right, in this
Uh-huh.
book, Irnerio, and Calvino is aware of that kind of position. There is the Lotaria, who is Ludmilla's sister, who is a kind of committed reader, someone who always wants to find the real meaning, like how a book is connected to the society, the production. So it's also sort of a Marxist reader, and in this way we can also see some kind of reflection of Calvino's own position within the Italian culture of the 60s, 50s, 60s, and then 70s. Then there is Ludmilla, just this passionate reader who would like to see books grow as if they were plants. So there is almost like this natural approach to the act of reading that is devoid of any other surplus meaning. So Ludmilla doesn't even want to get into a publishing house physically because she doesn't want to be infected in a way by the process of publishing the books. She wants to be just the reader who enjoys the books as they are. And then there is this protagonist who is not named. We don't know his name, and maybe that's for a reason. Maybe that's the one that Calvino initially wants us to identify with. But exactly as you said, more and more he acquires his own personality, and we are detached from them. So that's interesting because at the very, very beginning, the first few pages, Calvino almost summons us. So he talks to us. He says, "Stai per cominciare a leggere." You're about to start reading the new novel by Italo Calvino. So we feel, okay, he's talking to us. And then gradually we realize, yeah, it's us. But in a way, an archetype of reader at the same time. So all these things are constantly interconnected, and what I like is that there is no one right or wrong way of approaching the act of reading or even the act of writing in a way, because Calvino himself projects his name into the book, but then there are other authors. There is Silas Flannery, there is Hermes Marana, different approaches to the act of creation or plagiarism or translation. So it's really a book about million books and million approaches to books.
And of course, it makes us reflect upon what we're doing as we're reading, right? And so yes, the reader has no name in part because the reader's name is John or Claudia or whoever we happen to be, at least to
Yeah.
start off with. And then, as we find it more difficult to identify, perhaps I don't know. Yeah, we realize that when we read, we become perhaps different, right? We become other to ourselves to some extent.
Yes, which is, something that Calvino says. Is it Palomar that I think it's in Palomar where he says, "Oh, there is no, it doesn't make sense to refer to your life before you had written that book, that specific book, because somehow your life has brought you to the moment in which you were going to read that book, and everything after that makes you a different person. But at the same time, everything has brought you to that specific moment. So yeah, you grow with the book, and you will never be the same person afterwards. But somehow you can also, in retrospect, look at your own trajectory as a reader or as a person and see how different episodes of your life or different conversations has brought you to become that reader for that book at that specific point." I like that.
I like that too. Of course, you said that a reader can become impatient or frustrated reading this
Mm.
book, perhaps. And of course, it is a book about a frustrated reader. So, you begin to get into one of these books within the books, these beginnings or incipients, and then each time, as you say, they cut off, and you're looking for the continuation, and there never is any continuation. We were talking briefly earlier, and you were talking about Calvino's passion for beginnings. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is something that I hadn't not necessarily thought about a lot myself. And then I was reading a chapter by Mario Barenghi, and he says, yes, if we start thinking about it, several of Calvino's protagonists are young. So if you go to the first novel, Il sentiero dei nidi di ragno, the Path to the Spider's Nest, the main protagonist is a boy, Pin. Most of the protagonists of Calvino's early stories are relatively young. Or there are also even Cosimo, the protagonist of the Baron in the Trees, Il Barone Rampante. Large part of the narration follows him as he's quite young, and then you follow his entire trajectory as a human being. But the most the strongest images that stay with you are of when he's a young character and person. Or you even have books that deal with new chapters in people's life. So that's the case in Smog, La nuvola di Smog, or La speculazione edilizia, where you have these characters that are about to embark on something new, or even Calvino's own fascination for folk tales, which are very much about new beginnings, new experiences, new quests. Um, so clearly, this book, and by the way, the working title of If on a Winter's Night a Traveler was Incipit. And
Uh-huh.
incipit is, the Latin, and also in Italian we use that, term to refer to the beginning, right? And even Calvino's Lezioni Americane, the six memos for the next millennium that he delivered, he was supposed to deliver at Harvard University, but then he died right before that. Again, the working title was Cominciare e finire, so to begin and to end. And then he went on and developed them, and he came up with the very, well-known values of multiplicity, exactitude, and so on and so forth. So clearly he has this interest, this passion, and also he was a writer who always wanted to change. And again, he kind of mirrors that also in the book. He says, in the very first part of the frame, he says, this is a book by that author that is always different, but by being different, you recognize that it's him, right? So if we think about his trajectory, he always tried to surprise his readers. And obviously that came with, some kind of cost. He experienced also some moments of kind of creative crisis. And this book actually is the one that came after the longest period of silence for Calvino. So this was published in 1979, and for at least 6 years before that, he had not published anything creatively, but always, obviously, he kept being very active from an editorial point of view as a commentator. Um, so yeah, so the beginnings, and this book is almost like a love letter to this passion of his, I would say, to this passion for new beginnings.
I like that idea a lot. Let's talk a little bit about those beginnings. Uh, Actually, it's interesting. I hadn't realized that this book was produced after a period of, I don't know, crisis, you said, or after a silence. Of course, in each beginning, he he speaks in another voice in some ways, right? He tries
Mm.
out these different voices, right? They're all pastiches or parodies or genres of fiction that he is imitating and adapting to some extent. So we get the kind of spy novel at the very beginning. There's, as you said, a Borgesian chapter or beginning. There's one which is a bit like the Mexican author Pedro Paramo. I know you've worked, as I think you mentioned, you've worked particularly on the Japanese chapter,
Mhm.
which is towards the end. I wonder if you could talk a little a bit about how he is adapting or reworking, or what he's trying to do there with Japanese models.
Yeah, so this is the eighth incipit, eighth beginning, su un tappeto di foglie illuminato dalla luna, so on a or the carpet of leaves illuminated by the moon. And here Calvino is reproducing both a very Japanese theme, this kind of eroticism, and also the pace of many novels that he had read, a rather slow and again kind of exasperating slow pace. And I say I'm referring to the books he had read because my project started started with the catalog. I helped cataloging some of the books that were in Calvino's own library, and I realized that he had read quite extensively, quite a good number of Japanese novels. So, for example, so in this chapter, you have a protagonist, Mr. Okeda, um, sorry, a protagonist who is not named, who meets Mr. Okeda, who very much looks like a Zen master in a way, and he reflects with him about how he's interested in describing things, in looking at the leaves that fall, looking at each leaf, and kind of looking at the space between each leaf, and he makes a comparison between that process and the process of writing a novel because they both involve an element of taming nature, of kind of adding order to something that is very much disordered or chaotic, like life and nature and the environment around. And then soon he seduces Mr. Okeda's wife and also his daughter. And these elements, for example, the competition between a mother and a daughter is something that recurs in a number of Japanese novels. So, for example, A Thousand Cranes or The Key. So, A Thousand Cranes by Kawabata and was published in 1952. The Key is another masterpiece by Tanizaki. But even the idea that the daughter in this short story sees her mother having an affair with this Western person, and that's also something that is part of, for example, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion by Mishima Yukio. In there, the protagonist sees like one of his parents' extramarital affair, and that kind of generates a number of traumas. And so Calvino has really kind of taken some of these episodes, some of these themes, or at least the atmospheres of this books he had read, and he has reinterpreted them. And in an interview, he says, I particularly enjoyed reading the chapters that were the farthest away from my own style. And he mentions the Japanese one. So he clearly tried to do something different, and he had a few examples to follow in that respect.
Of course, there's a delicate balance here between an homage to this work that he'd read and a sort of exoticism as
Mm.
well at the same time. Um, do you feel, yeah, I mean, how do you feel he manages to negotiate that balance?
Yeah, no, this is a very it's a very good question that I, reflected quite extensively on. I do think that Calvino falls into some sort of exoticism more than once. At the same time, we also have to take into account that the very authors that he read uh, were very much self-orientalizing, self-exoticizing. So, for example, Calvino had also reviewed in an essay called Un viso bianco nel buio. He had reviewed Tanizaki's Libro d'Ombra, or Elogio d'Ombra has been translated in different ways in Italian. And that's a book that has been criticized even, within Japan for a strong self-orientalization that Tanizaki makes of Japanese beauty or Japanese wabi-sabi and all these kind of concepts of, impermanence. And so yes, I do acknowledge and sometimes in the stories that Calvino wrote when he was in Japan, because he had also visited Japan in 1976, he sometimes has a tone that is clearly the tone of a Western white man, not understanding and not really wanting to understand some behaviors of Japanese people, and in particular Japanese women. And I'm thinking about this chapter, An Old Woman in a Purple Kimono, which is in Collections of Sand. So I think we have to acknowledge that, because sometimes we tend to treat these authors as, saints that cannot be criticized. But, in a way they were also part of a particular period of time, and they maybe, the sensibility that we have today maybe wasn't there necessarily all the time. So there is an element of exoticism, there is an element of gender stereotypization as well. But all that is used and transposed for the sake of art in a way, for the sake of creating something that in this chapter in particular can be easily identified as Japanese. So somehow, I'm sympathetic. If he had to convey the Japanese-ness in a way of this chapter, he had to use certain tropes, and he does that.
And you mentioned the gender aspects here.
Yeah.
Of course, this particular chapter, I think, is notable also for its eroticism. You actually have a sex scene in there. Um, and so it's interesting because I think Calvino, and perhaps this book in particular, I'm not quite sure, or postmodern metafiction in general is often seen as kind of cerebral, kind of games with texts. But
Mhm.
Calvino is interested in the body and in
Mhm.
bodies in this book too. And I know you have something, we were talking before, you have some thoughts about the way in which this particular treatment of sex and erotics in this chapter also may disrupt in some ways questions or notions about the male gaze, for instance. I wonder if you could say
Mhm.
a little bit about that.
Yes, because in this scene, I'm not sure how clearly I I explained what happens there, and actually it's quite shady, it's quite sketchy everything that happens. So but the point is, as I said, like this male protagonist has a sexual encounter with the wife of Mr. Okeda, and at some point he realizes that all the time they had been, intentively observed by the daughter of this woman and of Mr. Okeda. And and then they also realized that Mr. Okeda had been there looking at his daughter, looking at them having a sexual encounter. But the fact that there is a female character looking at the sexual encounter, to me represents an interesting variation on the theme of the male gaze. So on one hand, we do have the male gaze. That's the gaze of the Western protagonist going to Japan and seducing a Japanese woman. There is also the male gaze of Mr. Okeda himself. But everything is kind of made more complex by the presence of this girl who also looks. So she challenges and decenters the human, the male gaze itself, adding, a further layer of nuances and of questions that we ask ourselves. And again, this is something that in my book I tried to connect also to the kind of decentralization of the human, to quote, that Calvino goes through when visiting Japanese gardens, where the human being is constantly directed in how they behave by the environment that they navigate. So I tried to create a connection between this decentralization of the human and decentralization of the male gaze in this specific chapter. And this is all connected also to the element of the embodiment that, again, we kind of touched upon briefly earlier on, because this book is very much a book about bodies as well as about minds that read and that create. So again, even in the frame, we start with this reader who is about to begin reading If on a Winter's Night and has to find the right position, has to find the right light. So reading is not an abstract act. It's very much part of an embodied experience of the world around us. And again, A little idea that I have been thinking about recently is as I was reading something completely different. I was reading Carlo Rovelli, which is this Italian scholar of physics, who, he's the main exponent of the relational interpretation of quantum physics, quantum theory. And he says that basically there is nothing outside relations, and every property of everybody, and everybody is a quantum body to an extent, is constantly influenced by the relationships in which this body is inscribed. And so, and our knowledge as human beings cannot be detached from the world that we are trying to make sense of. So at the same time, we interact with the world, and the world influences us, and there is nothing outside this. So the idea of an objective reality, of an absolute reality, is, doesn't make sense at the end of the day. And, physics confirms that. And I think that in this book, Calvino, to an extent, although he's been criticized by some for having created a relatively abstract book, but I think he's actually doing the opposite. He's very much giving body and materiality and matter to the act of reading. And he's exposing this process of constant correlation, constant interrelation, interconnection between human beings, between even, the light in which they are reading, the oxygen in the room, and more broadly, the environment that they inhabit.
That's a fantastic way of thinking about reading in general, and this book in particular. And we're out of time basically, but I also love from this book the idea that, as you're saying, we never read in the abstract. We read in particular places and in particular conditions and circumstances, and we never read alone. And
Yes.
I love this, the fact that perhaps in this conversation we've been able to compare our readings of this particular book, and I hope other people can compare their readings with our readings as well. Claudia Dellacasa, thank you so much for your generosity of time and thought. This has been fantastic.
Thanks to you. I loved having this conversation with you, John.
Thank you.